my name is Cory. Welcome to part 2 of our 3-part webinar series on the Stope Optimizer in GeoVS SERPAC. In part 1, we covered the basic first run of the Stope Optimizer, what each of the boxes means, how the numbers generally affect the output, to ensure that you can get a first set of results from any block model that you're given. In part 2, we will be covering some more advanced topics, constraints to structure allowing us to analyze some specific use cases, some thin vein deposits, which is a very asked for and requested topic, addressing some questions and concerns from the last video, and how to recode the block model into your stopes after you have done some engineering work and design work to the stopes, so post-processing. I'll begin by addressing some questions from the previous webinar. The first question, the most common question that I got is, why did I use NSR as my optimization? What was the decision that led to that? And the reason really is that if you open up the Stope Optimizer tool, in the cutoff tab, you are limited to one optimization field. So if you have a multi-element deposit, as I did have last time, then it is advisable to turn that into a single optimization field. If you have multiple elements and you only care to optimize on one, then you can select that here for your cutoff. If you have a single element deposit, similarly, I can select my zinc here as my grade and run it based off cutoff grade. If you have multiple elements, then it would be recommended to turn that into either a grade equivalent or an NSR, or to do your block value calculation and run off a value. That way you're turning multiple elements into a single quality for optimization. The calculated value here has a limitation where, again, it runs off a single grade element. So you're doing a simple block value calculation off of a single grade element. So if you have a multi-element deposit, again, it doesn't quite work for this option. That's why I chose NSR and how to sort of make that choice for yourself. The next question is what costs to include if you are doing a value or a calculated value. If you're running off cutoff grade, in general, you're not factoring in necessarily all of your development costs to get there, all of your mining costs and so on. You are factoring based off of almost entirely the processing cost of that block of ore. So that can be rather limiting in some cases. They require a much more complicated structure to work in any detritus elements, for instance, or to factor in that development cost to get to the ground. If you're doing a new mine from scratch and you don't have any existing workings, there's quite a lot of development that has to happen just to get to the stopes underground in the first place. That should be factored into that optimization to ensure that you're not coming in under budget. If you are expanding an existing mine, on the other hand, a lot of that work has already been done and doesn't necessarily need to factor into this newer expansion. You can just work on what development is required to get there, the additional 1 or 2 levels of drifts, for instance. The final question to address is the question of speed concerns. How do I make this run as fast as possible? And we did address last time in the input-output tab, there is the use multi-threading option, which allows it to run using all of the processors or the number of processors specified under customized default preferences in SERPAC to do your optimization. This will speed things up dramatically. Alternately, you can use the Run Stope Optimizer bulk or multiple to run multiple iterations in parallel, which will speed it up by just having more things running at the same time. So you're not waiting for one to finish, then the next, and so on. Finally, just a bit of general advice is when you're doing your Stope framework and slicing up for the tubes, it's advisable to slice them along the block lines if you can, the user block size, or increments thereof. The more that each tube is self-contained and the fewer times it has to iterate through a given block, the faster that runtime will be. So if you can make your sections and intervals along those block lines, the user block lines, and your Stope geometry to fall in increments of block sizes, that will increase the runtime. It's not always feasible, but it can. Similarly, the fewer number of sub-blocks that you have in a given user block size, the faster it'll run, because the fewer blocks it has to then add into each time it's checking. So if you have a single user block size, for instance, and you're doing everything in increments of that block size, it will run as fast as possible. That's not very realistic. You're going to have sub-blocks. But if you have a user block size that's 10 by 10 and sub-blocks that are 0.6 by 0.6, that can increase the runtime. Now, to what degree it increases it will depend on your unique situations, of course, but that is just general advice for how to get faster runtimes out of the program. So we do understand that we cannot cover every possible use case and geology there is. Every geology is a little bit unique. If you have a specific concern about your geology, your workflows, and you would like us to take a look with you, then please do contact support as well, and we are happy to do so. The second topic today is going to be an approach to room and pillar mining. This mining method is characterized with deposits that are typically very flat and thin. So if I display this block model, we see that in the XY direction, it is relatively flat and does not dip terribly steep. It is characterized by very long rooms where you have to leave pillars behind or waste columns to support the ceiling so it doesn't collapse. The placement, spacing, size, all this is going to be determined by geotechnical constraints. There are rules for this, equations you can use. Sometimes there are columns that have to be placed every 20 meters, 10 meters. It depends on your specific geotechnical constraints. What we're going to be doing is running the Stope Optimizer iteratively on this block model to see the shadows of where SERPAC will leave behind pillars. The Stope Shape Optimizer is not designed to optimize pillar placement. It's designed to optimize stope placement. But by running increasing cutoff grades, we can see where SERPAC will leave behind these pillars when it's not profitable. So to do that, the first thing we will do is create our XML file. So I open that up. And we're going to be running on the slice method. And to make things faster for myself, I modified the extents and the origin so that I'm only looking at this top half of the deposit. This just speeds up all of the runtime. Next, I'm going to be sectioning on the XZ, so I will be driving my tubes lengthwise through the deposit this way. And I gave it the drift dimension, 6 by 6. That is what my mining method allows me to mine as a corridor. In stope geometry, I want to give it very long stopes. So I set a minimum of 6. 6 is the minimum for it to be worthwhile, otherwise I can't mine it. And 30 is just to give it a stopping point to see where it's going to adjust to prioritize material. You can, in theory, give it a max that is the entire length. I'm just doing 30. I give it a minimum pillar width of 6. This is based on the geotechnical requirements in the area. Any smaller than 6 and it is not strong enough to support the rooms around it. And that's the only requirement I use. Once I do that, I'm going to be running the design Stope Shape Optimizer in bulk tool. I will feed it my project that I created and give it cutoffs of, say, 1 to 10 in steps of 1. You can give as many as you like. What this will do is create that many projects, as you just saw on the left there, and it will run them in parallel, so that this will all run much faster than if you did them one at a time. Once they have been run, we end up with results that will look like this. I will hide my block model, and I will look at my planes here just to show an example that you see it creates these very long stopes. Now, not all of the stopes are 30, so it is leaving behind some material in this case and not maximizing it. If you gave it the full length of the deposit, you would do the same thing. So it will leave behind some waste blocks, and it won't necessarily just create stopes that are the entire length. You may have to increase the cutoff for it, but it will happen. This tells us where now SERPAC will put these pillars and not mine material. So all of these are good candidates for where to start looking at pillar placement. Once we have the start of it, we can fill in the rest of the pattern as needed. But this gives us a starting point. Now this tells us in one direction where those stopping points are, but not in the other direction. For that, we will run a second series where our stope framework would be the same because we're still looking in the direction of a drift, but our stope geometry will now be 4 to 6. We're doing the crosscut. So this is just to connect the two sets of horizontal drifts. same minimum pillar width, etc. And that will give us a second series in the X direction that will look like this. Now, this will be a lot more sparse because we're only interested in crosscuts where it might connect to horizontal, or to vertical in this case because it follows the Y direction, planes. If we combine the two, now, we get something that will look like this. We have our vertical in blue, our Y direction in blue, and our X direction in green. And we can see where it will connect and where it really highlights the ore in this case. And we can see stop points like here where there is neither blue nor green. And this is an ideal placement idea for a pillar. A good starting point to start building that pattern is with the ones where there is less material, where they don't overlap entirely. There's gaps. Once you have a starting point, you can then fill in the rest of your pattern. You can start there and go every 10 meters. You can fill it in as required by your geotechnical area. You can design around going in and out, etc. We can step down through the levels. And we can see and build these pillars. Now, this is for one cutoff. That doesn't really help us with, but what if we have to put pillars on top of stope, where it says to put stopes? That's why we do it in the increasing cutoffs. So now if we go to, say, cutoff 5, this is going to be much more sparse than the previous one was. And if we go to cutoff 10, even more so. So we can really see by building in increasing cutoffs, we can see where it's going to prioritize ore and highlight the ore, and where we definitely don't want to put our pillars. Once we've coded once we have an idea of where our pillars are, we create the solids for them, and we code them into our block model, or alternately you set the background value to be your pillar material and you code your stope values into your block model. We will then run a final iteration through our Stope Optimizer, where we will run it in Stope Optimizer, where we will run it using horizontal slices. So we're going to be looking for from the top down. We will give it a framework section and interval that is our entire room plus pillar size. So in this case, we've been using 6 for both, so we will do 12 by 12. This allows for the presence of one pillar per room and pillar combination. In our stope geometry, we will set our stope width to be our height. We've been using a 6 by 6, so in this case we'll do 5 to 7. And a minimum pillar width is determined by whether you can have stopes on top of stopes, whether you can have a room on top of a room at this point. If you can, what is the minimum requirement for that? If you can't, you can put just a very high minimum pillar width between them, so that you cannot put a room on top of a room. It will have to prioritize which one is more important. Otherwise, you can do the minimum pillar width required to the minimum floor spacing required. In our constraint to structure now, we can exclude pillar material here. So this allows us to specify our pillar material with a default code if anything is missing, and we can give it a code, I used pillar, with a maximum exclusion fraction. So I can say that up to 0.25% of the pillar, of the stope is allowed to be pillar material. That allows for the presence entirely of one pillar inside of a given stope shape. Under stope shape refinement now, we can create subshapes, and this allows us to select under the variable subshape control fractional sizing for our substopes, so that we specified a stope had to be 12 by 12, but by using the fractional breaking, we can then break it into smaller pieces and consider the smaller shapes. This allows us to design around corners of our rooms that we're building, our stope shapes that we're building. Through a combination of those two things, the exclusion and the fractional sizing, we're able to design our room shapes. It gives us a very good starting point for our room shapes. This is not going to be the end result. You are going to have to do this iteratively. You're going to have to do design work to turn this into a feasible shape afterwards. But as you can see from this example data that we have here, the end result that was designed is actually very close to what was being planned out with the Stope Shape Optimizer tool. You can see they actually intersect very closely. This design was done pre-Stope Shape Optimizer. There are some areas where the geotechnical constraints, such as here, do go a bit outside of this plan or zone, but for the most part, they actually line up very closely. For thin vein deposits, there are two types of questions that we typically get asked: how to incorporate a dilution skin and how to get the stopes to follow the shape of the thin vein without incorporating too much extra material on either side. For this, we will look at our thin vein deposit, where we have a solid that looks like so, very thin. Now for this solid, there are two approaches we can take for getting the stopes to follow the solid. We can use either level strings, gradient strings for the levels, which will look like so, and really they're just represent the development strings of the top and bottom of our solid, so where we can mark the top lines and the bottom lines. These strings can be either horizontal or at an incline, as I have here. They will both generate results. The second method is to use the boundary surface method, where the stopes, instead of being done as flat slices through the tube, it will instead use the front and back of the solid itself to generate the faces of the stopes. So we will look at the boundary surface method first. We'll open up that XML file. For the boundary surface method, the difference is here is that, and we will still do it at 5 wide by 20 high, so standard sectioning. We specify under using surface, this is the solid that we are using. It does say surface, but the stope boundary surface implies front and back surface, so the solid. Under stope geometry, you'll notice this looks a little bit different, where the dilution is now a much bigger portion on the right, where we can apply values for width. So it will use the faces to cut off the stopes where applicable, or we can apply a dilution skin here. So a single value from the model or varying by thresholds if we would choose. And this just creates the stope using the faces and then adds dilution on either side, if we so choose. I did not, so that I can show how it follows the curve of the face. Apply the stope width and the minimum pillar. And under stope shape refinement, we have much fewer options. We can only generate full and sub shape and refine the number of points being used along the sides. We cannot do smoothing or merging or any of the other options on the right when we do boundary surface. The results for this will look like so. So these solids follow, and why the flashing and the overlapping is because that is where they lie directly on top of the triangles. So if we turn off our vein itself, we will see that these are stopes that got created within the surface, and the faces are much more complex than the flat faces of our previous runs. These do follow the surface shape. So these are how you would get stopes that follow the vein much more closely. The second method is to use the level strings. So to do this, we would open up, and under the slice method, under stope framework, we can specify fixed levels and gradient string levels, or variable sections with gradient string levels. We will be using fixed sections for the purpose of this run. We're using our 5-unit width again. This is a good size for a thin vein stope. And we will be applying our gradient strings here. This can be, as mentioned, either the horizontal strings or the ones that are at a gradient, as it implies. Under our slice definition, we're going to be using our boundary surface for the purpose of this. You can also use no control at all, or the model as usual. Under stope geometry, now for stope shape refinement, we will be applying an enforced alignment for narrow ore, where it will try and enforce the center of the stopes to line up as it creates them. This will allow us to follow them through the vein much more closely, and they won't be as disjointed, so we can have a single development string through the bottoms and tops. When we run this, we will get these results here. Now this one, it is creating the staggered offset, but you will notice that even when it staggers them like so, they are aligned in the center as they go. So this allows us to be much more consistent with these results. Now these are going to go with the levels.str, and you'll see that the tops and bottoms of these stopes match the strings that we entered. So that if this was our development string, it would follow that while still matching where the vein is over here. If we apply it with the gradient, the inclined strings, they look very similar, but they also match our inclined strings like so. So with the combination of these tools, you should be able to run most narrow vein deposits. The third question is how, or it really falls in line with how do I get it to follow the seams. If you have multiple veins that are at odd angles to each other, then what you can do is break up the deposit. So what I did for the purpose of this run, for instance, is that I created, on using my thinvein.xml, my Stope framework. If I display that bounding box, it's much smaller than my actual deposit. So if I recalculate that, you will see it gets much bigger. If I select here, there we go. It gets much bigger. It was doing that because I did not actually have the model open. It was just, so it had to reopen the model. That's all. But it's much bigger. So I truncated it to match this region. You can do that for the different regions. So if I had a different one at a right angle over here, I can turn that into two different runs so that it's not overstressing the angle change between them by changing the extents here. You can also do it using the constraint to structure exclusions or inclusions, so that you would code each vein with its own ore type, and then it will run only on that included material or exclude the other materials. The final topic today is just how to recode your SDM files once you've changed them, once you've edited them, once you've taken your stope shape and then carved out the development drift going through them, or you've done your several stoping and now you have to put your drifts through them for your development workings, or you make any changes at all. Maybe you merge two stopes together. Maybe you lengthen them, fit in the ring shapes, any sort of changes you make. The function for doing that is under Solids, Solids Tools, SDM Tools, Code Solid from Block Model. This function allows you to specify the solid that you are using, the block model you are using, specific gravity either by attributes in the block model or with a single value. So we can use density. You can use partial percentages, which we recommend. 3 is pretty standard. It'll give a good value. 5 will be the most accurate or precise that you can get. It will increase the runtime, sometimes dramatically increase the runtime. So 3 is a good starting point to see if the results are going to be sufficient. They often, almost always are. So 3 is really good to start with. Give it a report file name, and then decide how you are classifying this. So you need to give it the rock type classification that you are using, and then which attributes you want to code. And this will then scan the block model, and it will recode to the SDM properties, the metadata, what values it's recording, the same way that it does when doing the report output from the Stope Optimizer. So this has been the Advanced Stope Optimizer webinar. I hope that it has been useful for you. If you have any questions or you want us to look at any of your data specifically, please let us know. You can either put it in the chat now or let us know by email at your convenience. Thank you.